All right, let me get the screen share going.
While Kira's getting that set up, if people have questions along the way, please put them into the chat and we'll go through the questions after the presentation.
All right, so first I'd like to thank all of you for coming to my presentation. I appreciate all of you making the time to log on tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Saito. I'm the research intern here at EcoFaith Recovery, and I'm a senior psychology major at Willamette University. Since this summer, I've been researching transgenerational trauma, leadership, environmental racism, and storytelling, and I'm very excited to finally be able to share with you all what I've been learning. And so in the middle of this presentation, I'm going to ask a couple short questions, and you may want to write down your answers, so I would suggest grabbing pen or pencil or using your notes app or something. And then there will be some breakout room discussion time and a Q&A at the very end. So yeah, if you have any questions, like Michael said, put them in the chat, and we will go over them later. And then as we get into this presentation, I'd like to do some quick introductions, and for the sake of time, could everybody type their name, where you are, and any group affiliations you have into the chat as we're getting started. All right, and we'll start off with a spiritual grounding, and I'd like to invite Scott to read this poem by Joy Harjo called Remember.
Sorry, Kira, I was introducing myself.
No worries.
So yeah, this is a favorite poem of mine, of course, by Joy Harjo, who is Muskogee Creek, born in Oklahoma, and really writes a lot about about her and her indigenous roots and the trauma of the people of her people. So this poem is titled Remember, and I'll go ahead and read it. Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point in time. Remember sundown and the giving away. The screen just went blank on me.
It's back.
Okay, yes. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away tonight. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life, and her mother's and hers. Remember your father, he is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are, red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth, we are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life, who all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them, listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind, remember her voice. She knows the origin of this universe. Remember, you are all people, and all people are you. Remember, you are this universe, and this universe is you. Remember, all is in motion, is growing, is you. Remember, language comes from this. Remember the dance, language is, that life is. Remember.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for bringing that poem and introducing me to Joy Harjo. I've read a few of her poems since you told me about her, and I really love them. So I'm gonna start out with my story. So hold on, when I do this, is the screen going blank? Or is it, it's not, okay. So here, I think the first and one of the only times I've ever talked to my family about our family history in the Japanese internment camps was when I was in high school. My sophomore year history teacher assigned us a family history project that we had to present to the class. I remember that day I got home and asked my dad a million questions about my grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents. And instead of trying to explain to me my entire family history, he pulled me out of class a couple days later and took me to the Oregon Nikai Legacy Center, which is now called the Japanese American Museum of Oregon. I remember the walls were covered in pictures from Minidoka, the internment camp where the Japanese Americans from Oregon were taken. I remember that there was a book there with the list of names of all the internees, and I flipped through it until I got to S and saw Saito with my great-grandparents' names in front of it. And I flipped back to O and saw Okino, my grandmother's maiden name, with my great-grandparents' names in front of it. When I got home, I texted my grandpa and I asked him what he knows about our family history, and he sent me back almost a full essay telling me how our family, at least the Saito side, came to the United States. The simplified version is that both sides of my family, the Saito and Okino sides, have a pretty similar story. Both my great-great-grandfathers were born in Portland, Oregon, to immigrants from Hiroshima, Japan, and their picture brides. My Saito side worked in logging, railroads, and laundry. This is a picture of my great-great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather. And my Okino side worked as farmers. When World War II hit, the first, second, and third generation Saitos and Okinos were interned in Minidoka. After the war, my Okino side got their farm back because they were lucky enough to have neighbors who kept it for them. My Saito side began to operating a hotel in downtown Portland. This is where my grandfather and most of his brothers and sisters grew up. They lived in the hotel until a fire burned it down in 1955 when my grandfather was in the 3rd grade. There were 4 people that died in the fire, and one of them was my great-grandmother's father, who died trying to warn the residents. The building was destroyed, and it's still just a parking lot today. All the generations that were born after the war were given American names and spoke only English. My grandparents and their siblings were, for the most part, highly successful in their careers. My great-grandpa Saito died a year after I was born. I was his first great-grandchild and the only one he ever met. But his wife Fumi helped raise me and my brother and was able to come to watch my first collegiate soccer game. I don't think I ever heard her talk about the internment camps or really about her past at all. But she was a very quiet person in general, and at family gatherings, she would just sit in her chair and watch everyone with this huge smile on her face. All she ever wanted was a huge, happy family, and that's what she got. Doing all this research on transgenerational trauma has really helped me understand how my family became what it is today and the dynamics that made it this way. I hope this information that I present to you will help you understand your story, your family's story, or the stories of leaders that you admire. All right, so first I'm going to go over the levels of racism. There are 3 levels: institutionalized racism, personally mediated racism, and internalized racism. Institutionalized racism involves how race influences the access one has to goods, services, and opportunities. It's normative, sometimes legalized, and it's manifested in material conditions and power. Personally mediated racism encompasses prejudice and discrimination. It can be intentional or unintentional and manifests as a lack of respect, dehumanization, suspicion, scapegoating, and devaluation. Internalized racism is the individual's acceptance and internalization of negative messages about their own race. It results in the embracing of whiteness, self-devaluation, resignation, helplessness, and hopelessness. So to better understand these levels, to kind of illustrate them, imagine a gardener who's about to plant red and pink flowers in her garden. She has 2 flower boxes, one with rich, fertile soil and another with poor, rocky soil. She prefers the pink flowers. Because she prefers the pink flowers, she plants them in a box with rich soil and the red flowers in the box with poor soil. As the flowers grow, she notices that the pink ones grow much bigger and stronger than the red ones. And she thinks to herself that she was right for liking the pink flowers the most. Year after year, the flowers drop their seeds into the same box, and if they blow into the other box, the gardener plucks the seeds from the ground before they can bloom, resulting in the pink flowers growing the biggest and strongest for many generations. Over time, the gardener's children grow up favoring the pink flowers because their whole lives they've witnessed the pink flowers growing bigger and stronger than the red ones. In this illustration, institutionalized racism is seen in the original decision to separate the flowers into the 2 boxes by color preference, the structure of the boxes that keeps the different soils separate, and the gardener not acting to fix the soil conditions for the red flowers. The personally mediated racism is seen in the gardener's disdain for the red flowers and not allowing them to grow in the same box as the pink ones. The internalized racism in the story is a little bit more difficult to illustrate, but it occurs when the red flowers refuse to be pollinated with pollen from the red flowers and only want to be pollinated with pollen from the pink flowers. They've internalized the gardener's belief that pink is better than red. To set things right in the garden, the gardener and her children could make the flowers feel better by telling them that red is beautiful too. The gardener's children could convince the gardener to stop plucking the red seeds from the ground before they have a chance to grow. Or they could break down the boxes and mix the soil, allowing for both red and pink flowers to grow to their full potential. To apply this to real life, you could think about the gardener as representative of the United States government and the flowers as the people. So the definition of environment embeds environmental racism into every story by going beyond the traditional conservationist and preservationist definitions of the non-human world to include those spaces where human beings also live, work, play, learn, and pray. Environmental inequality affects housing, economics, healthcare, immigration, and consequently all other aspects of life. For decades, researchers have reported that communities that are most likely to contain hazardous waste sites, be the most affected by climate change, experience the most natural disasters, and be located where there are high levels of contaminated air, water, and land, are those with high percentages of people of color, low-income persons, indigenous people, and immigrants. These populations also experience food injustices such as inequitable access to healthy, nutritious, affordable, culturally appropriate, and sustainable foods. These hazardous conditions result in numerous serious health issues such as cancer and respiratory illness. There has even been documentation of epigenetic alteration of sperm for 3 generations after the initial exposure of environmental toxins such as pesticides, plastics, and jet fuel. So trauma is the result of a real, distressing, or disturbing event that breaches the psyche and disrupts the sense of self. A collective or historical trauma is used to refer to a traumatic event that affects a large group of people. Although this concept was initially framed as a response to a big event, such as the Holocaust, it has been expanded to cover the response to forces of structural violence which have persisted for centuries, such as the forced removal of Native Americans from their land. Chosen trauma has been passed down for many generations. Chosen trauma is collective trauma that has been passed down for many generations. Chosen trauma refers to the mental representation of a traumatic event at the hands of an enemy that has caused a large group to face drastic losses, feel helpless and victimized by another group, and share a humiliating injury. The word chosen reflects the group's unconscious choice to pass this mental representation down to future generations due to their inability to mourn losses and reverse the humiliation. Chosen trauma does not refer to more recent traumatic events because the survivors' stories are still alive through direct memories, pictures, or belongings. But over time, when there are no more direct links to the traumatic event, the function of the trauma changes. Groups experience a number of traumas, but only the most significant become chosen traumas. And this is because they are linked to entitlement ideologies, the descendants feeling entitled to regain what was lost in the event. Individual identity is defined as a persistent sameness within oneself. And large group identity is the subjective experience of thousands or millions of people who are linked by a persistent sense of sameness, while also sharing numerous characteristics with others in foreign groups. There are two forms of large group identity, one that develops in childhood and another that develops in adulthood. Large group identities that develop in childhood exist worldwide, and some are internationally inclusive. They're core pieces of identity that make up who we are, and they're given to us by our parents and other important people in our lives when we are very young. Examples of large group identities that develop in childhood are tribal, ethnic, national, and religious identities. The large group identities that develop in adulthood are up to the individual and the choices they make. Examples of this kind of identity are being a fan of a football team or having gone to a specific university. Because as adults, we are exposed to more ideas and have much more of a choice in what we believe. It's possible that these identities that we choose in adulthood can be problematic or even dangerous. Gaining a large group identity by becoming a part of a religious cult or a terrorist organization only happens in adulthood and involves picking and choosing aspects of core identities to exaggerate or forget. Large group identities that develop in adulthood can also be seen as subgroups or sub-identities inside the core large group identity that has been developed in childhood. These sub-identities can be easily changed, and the change may come with some anxiety, but not always. Changing your core large group identity, on the other hand, always creates a lot of anxiety. For example, getting a new job may come with some anxiety or it may not, but either way, it's relatively easy to adapt to this new subgroup. But moving to a new country comes with a lot of anxiety, and it's much harder to adapt to biculturalism than it is to adapt to a new job. All right, so now I'd like everyone to take out their piece of paper and writing utensils or whatever you're using, and write down the phrase "I am blank," and then fill in the blank with the first thing that comes to mind. And then I want you to do this 2 more times so that you have 3 phrases in total. And then I want you to quickly jot down what kind of identity each phrase indicates. Individual identity, large group identity that developed in childhood, or large group identity that developed in adulthood. And then if you could just like raise your hand or something to let me know that when you're finished, that would be great. I see some thumbs up and I'm seeing some hands. Is everyone ready to go? Cool. And then we will do more with that later in our breakout groups. All right, so the tent analogy is helpful to illustrate the relationship between large group members, leaders, and their collective identity. So growing up, we learn to wear two layers like fabric or clothing. The first one we wear is fitted to us and it grows as we grow. It's our individual identity, the part of ourselves that is consistent and provides a sense of internal continuity as we move through life. The second layer is the canvas of a tent, and it's shared by thousands or millions of people. This layer represents our large group identity that's developed in either childhood or adulthood. Woven into the canvas are threads that represent different aspects of being a part of the large group. The threads I've identified here are the we-ness that was established in childhood, the shared identifications, the chosen glories, chosen traumas, the influence of the leader and their ideologies and symbols. Holding up the canvas of the tent is the leader of the large group, the tent pole. The members of the group idealize and identify with the leader. And because the idea of belonging to a specific large group means that people wear the same canvas and share the same ideologies, there is an inherent in-group bias. This in-group bias creates tension with the other, specifically because they wear a different canvas. Collective traumas are stored in cultural, communal, and familial sociocultural repositories. They are transmitted unconsciously through social learning, social identity, and psychodynamics. Cultural rituals and artifacts are the symbols that make up the threads of the canvas of large group identity, promoting solidarity, determination, and validation while increasing empathy, self-esteem, and social integration. Social learning theory explains how individuals, beginning in very early childhood, learn from others through observation, imitation, and modeling. It's a mechanism by which individuals draw sentiments in the form of cultural rituals and artifacts from the group and deposit them into their own ideologies. Social identity theory explains how identification with a large group shapes the attitudes, feelings, and behaviors of the group members. Every individual member of a large group has a mental representation of the group's history, and just by being a member, one experiences the emotions involved with this history. Psychodynamic theory explains how children develop emotional and unconscious processes that aid their personal development. This is how trauma is transmitted from parents to children as a family legacy, implicitly through emotions or behaviors. The transmission of collective trauma has also been described as the unconscious depositing of an image into future generations. There's also biological evidence of the transgenerational transmission of trauma that comes from the field of epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study of cellular variations that are caused by external environmental causes that switch genes on and off, thus making changes in the phenotype or genetic expression without concomitant changes in the DNA sequence or genotype, and can be thought of as a kind of memory. This is seen in human and non-human studies in which PTSD or susceptibility to PTSD is higher in offspring of parents who experienced a traumatic event. The most established evidence of transgenerational epigenetic change is in cases in which mothers were pregnant when they experienced the traumatic event. So an example of how collective trauma can be perpetuated by societal forces is the model minority myth. It began with the Japanese internment camps in World War II. The children and grandchildren of former internees report having very few conversations with their families about the internment camps. This was likely a protective measure done for the sake of the former internees not wanting to re-traumatize themselves or traumatize their children. So to further protect their children from future targeting, the former internees attempted to blend in with the mainstream American culture by minimizing or omitting the teaching of Japanese language and culture and urge their children to excel in school and in the workplace. This is how Asian Americans became portrayed as the model minority. Asian Americans who internalize this myth are often characterized by lack of confidence, chronic anxiety, imposter syndrome, and they show higher levels of psychological distress and negative attitudes towards help-seeking behaviors. The model minority myth itself is built into the racial hierarchy within the United States, putting Asian Americans below white individuals but above all other racial minorities. And this is just one example of how trauma is transmitted through familial and cultural practices. As a chosen trauma is transmitted transgenerationally, it changes function. Because the initial event and the specific memories related to it are now only history, the function of chosen trauma is to bind together members of the large group, becoming like a psychological gene that everyone in the group has. Over the course of many years, the trauma gets reactivated by various events, either in the individual lives of members or in the group itself, enhancing the leader-follower interaction. A leader may choose to reactivate a chosen trauma at times for the purpose of reconfirming or enhancing the large group identity. And when this reactivation occurs, so does a time collapse. Time collapse refers to the fears, expectations, fantasies, and defenses associated with a chosen trauma that reappear when both conscious and unconscious connections are made between the past trauma and a contemporary threat. This process magnifies the image of current enemies and current conflicts. The sense of revenge becomes exaggerated, and if the large group is in a powerless position, a current event may reactivate a sense of victimization. The transgenerational transmission of trauma has few positive aspects, but one positive is that leaders of collectively traumatized groups often develop values such as resilience, forgiveness, empathy, justice, and perseverance. Empathy is one of the most important values a leader can have, and storytelling plays a crucial role in building it. By being vulnerable and honest in your story, you create a space where others feel comfortable being vulnerable and honest with you. This allows for closer bonds to be made between group members, as well as between members and the leader. Empathy and power are typically inversely related, in the sense that people with more power usually have less empathy, and those with less power typically have more. This is because people with a lot of power are in a position where they don't often need to ask others for help, so they're less inclined to try to understand other people, while people with less power typically have to rely on each other much more, meaning that they spend more time attempting to understand other people. Empathy is like a muscle, and the more you use it, the stronger it becomes. By telling and listening to stories, you're working and building your empathy muscle. Leaders of collectively traumatized groups tend to have both power and empathy, which is why it's important to listen to their stories and learn from their experiences. So I know many of you know, or you should all know, be familiar with the Marshall-Ganz storytelling format, but I'm gonna give you a little summary anyway. So storytelling is one of the main ways that collective trauma is transmitted. The Marshall-Ganz storytelling format is based on 3 elements of self, us, and now. The story of self communicates a leader's values, their call to leadership, and individual identity. The story of us communicates shared values, strategies, points of intersection, culture, and distinguishes the we from the others. It's the story of large group identity. The story of now communicates the urgent challenges and demands action. The plot of your narrative shows how the character deals with the unexpected and overcame adversity, including chosen traumas. Stories need a protagonist for listeners to identify empathetically with in order to experience the full emotion of the story. And if empathetic identification is present, the listener should walk away with a felt understanding of what the character went through. By communicating emotion through storytelling, we are communicating values. and either inhibiting or facilitating action. Conflict or threats to a large group identity creates anxiety, and through storytelling, a leader can pair that anxiety with despair, producing withdrawal, rage, or freezing, or the leader can pair that anxiety with hope, producing curiosity and leading to exploration, learning, and problem solving. All right, so in a second, Jenny Lee is going to put you all into breakout groups of probably 2 to 3 people for, let's see, let's do like 10 minutes. And I'd like you to discuss how these identities that you wrote down earlier play a role in your story, how you develop these identities, and how often you think about your identities. And when I close the breakout groups, there will be a little bit of time for anyone who wants to share what they discussed in the
Kira, would you stick the questions in the chat as well?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I'm gonna open the rooms now and then we'll have 10 minutes. And then Allison, were you still there? Oh, wait, I can pause my recording.
All right, I think everyone's back now. So I just want to open it up for a little bit of discussion. If anyone wants to share what they talked about, I would encourage you to share, but you don't have to if you don't want to.
Well, Peter and I were just starting to have a conversation about the constructed identity of whiteness and the like what it takes to even think about releasing that identity, and what kind of deep trauma work needs to be done in order to somehow release that identity without releasing any of the accountability around it. What the hell does that look like? Who knows, right? And how like that whole conversation about epigenetic trauma and legacy trauma in that we as white people are carting around in our bodies is just not part of the conversation for 98% of the people who are thinking and talking about race, and how central it needs to be if we're actually going to move through this into something else.
And I didn't really want to get into this piece, but I will risk it. One of the things that I was really saddened by today was the school shooting, right? I mean, I don't know if everyone's kind of had a chance to process that, but in northern Michigan, or I guess somewhere north of Detroit, there was another high school shooting and 3 people were killed. And I don't know how many were injured. But I was thinking about that intergenerational violence that's part of our culture, that's part of our founding mythology, the idea of, you know, live free or die, the importance of gun culture to our founding myths and stories. And that's just passed on and on and on to this wildly excessive degree now, where we can't even think about how to do sensible gun control, how to keep our children safe. It's a piece of our culture that's just wildly broken. And it came up for me in the idea of this discussion about whiteness and intergenerational trauma.
I was sharing with Jenny Lee about, you know, and one of the identity statements I wrote down is I am a Christian, and you know, the question of do I think much about these identities, and yeah, I absolutely do, and the identity of I am a Christian is sort of a both in terms of the childhood identity and an adult identity, because I was raised Christian as a child, but I would not have written down I am a Christian as a young adult. I would not have done that. And so I kind of re-chose this identity as an adult. So it's both. But it comes with a lot of baggage, right? And I think I haven't been talking in terms of that baggage in terms of trauma, but it is, right? I still choose this identity, and I choose to stay with this identity, despite not accepting all of the things that go with being a Christian in the Christian tent. There are many things in the Christian tent that I want no part of, and so I think I hang on to this label because I see it, this identity, because I see it as a very valuable identity and something that's filled with lots of promise and just beautiful stories and wisdom, and that I can model the way as to be the Christian that I want to see in the world.
Scott, that's amazing. Kind of in tying it back to my story, which is I'm Jewish, and that was a formative thing as a child, but it's never not been front and center in my life by choice. And I don't identify with all Jews, for sure. There are many Jews who are not like me, but and then the second piece of identity is being the child of Holocaust survivors, and the trauma. I was mentioning it to Lauren. The trauma gets activated even today when I encounter anti-Semitism, and it actually gets encountered to a lesser degree, but also gets encountered or activated when I am in the presence of other racism and discrimination against other people. And that's partly an intention that I was given from my parents about how I needed to be in the world. And I took that to heart, and that became part of who I am and the work I do for a living and the work I continue to do as a person who is retired. So it's interesting how you describe that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. I really appreciate everything you said. It's all very deep and thoughtful, in a slightly different way than I was anticipating, but something that I really enjoy and appreciate. I have just one more section, and then we can go to the Q&A and then a regrounding at the end. So I'm going to share my screen again. All right. So putting it all together, leaders have a huge amount of power and influence because their followers identify with them under the same large group tent. Followers rely on their leaders to hold them up, keep them together, and motivate them for action when needed. Vulcan's tent analogy is a great illustration of large group structures, but I think that he leaves out a very important large group identity, that of living things on Earth. This 10 encompasses everything on Earth that interacts with the environment and is held up by many leaders spread across the globe. But this tent is torn and it's caving in where leaders don't hold it up. In the fight for environmental justice, there is no chosen trauma because there is no other. There is only we. So the trauma that has torn this tent has been self-inflicted. This makes it difficult for leaders to rally their group around an urgent threat because they have no true collective or chosen trauma to draw on to bring this large group together or to motivate them to action. Because of the various traumatic histories between the large group identities within this largest group identity, it's extremely difficult to bring them all together. The powerful countries are unwilling to patch the holes in the canvas, so they pick and choose where the holes are made. The holes themselves are placed disproportionately in powerless places within powerful countries. Just like how the gardener puts red flowers instead of pink ones in the flower box with poor soil, the United States chooses to locate hazardous materials in low-income and minority communities. This environmental racism perpetuates collective and chosen trauma by contributing to inequitable access to necessary resources. And the only way to fix this institutionalized racism is to break down the flower boxes and to combine the soil. All right, so now we have a little bit of time for some questions or comments or feedback of any kind. So if you have anything that you haven't typed into the chat box yet, please do so now. And I'd like to thank Michael for volunteering to help me keep all of this organized and read them off for me.
So thank you, Kira. I would invite people to indeed type questions in, but we're such a small group that typing the questions in, I think, will be useful for taking a picture of the chat. And so, that will be a good thing. But I'll start with one of the questions that did show up. Thank you, Tasha. So she says, so if chosen traumas are motivators, do they require othering to work? Wow. That's an interesting question. Let me read it again. If chosen traumas are our motivators, do they require othering to work?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that a chosen trauma, this one's difficult. I like this question. So if chosen traumas are our motivators, I would say that chosen traumas are part of motivation. They can be motivational. I would say that chosen traumas, just by definition, do require an othering because chosen traumas are at the hands of it. It's like trauma inflicted at the hands of the other. So I would say that in a sense, yes, but also in a sense, no, just because if you loosen that definition of chosen traumas, you can just say trauma, and trauma doesn't necessarily need othering to work. Trauma can be environmental, I guess. You can experience trauma from those natural disasters and things like that that don't necessarily have an other, but that do create a kind of trauma. And those can be motivational. Those can be very motivational. So I'd say yes and no.
Kira, I've got a question for you, and then I'm going to go to one that Peter has put in. Earlier on, you were talking about how one of your relatives, I think a great-grandmother, chose not to really talk to you or maybe even other family members about the stories of their experience. So they didn't talk to you about what it was like in the internment camps or how that impacted their lives in a greater sense, even after they got out. And your grandmother or great grandmother, whichever it was wasn't party or didn't have the benefit of your research. And what do you think her unconscious or intention was by holding that? Because you described some intentions that can happen from that. But what do you think was playing out for your relatives or relatives in general who might choose to either downplay or overlook the experiences they've been through?
Um, I have a lot of relatives that are very involved with the organ. I forgot what it's called now. It's the Japanese American Museum of Organ, I think. And they do a lot of fundraising and donations, and a lot of the pictures and little quotes and stuff in the museum are from a lot of my family members. But then there's also that unwillingness or like to like freely talk about it with the family, which I is kind of an interesting dynamic. It's kind of the aspect of keeping the trauma alive, wanting people to know what happened, but not necessarily really wanting to talk about it or to, I guess, be more personal with it. And I think it would be out of fear of further traumatizing the family, or like, yeah, I guess that would be.
So, in other words, they're trying to protect their descendants by not telling them from the hurt that they experienced, so that, and this fits with what you were talking about and what the science seems to say, so that you won't be traumatized by what they were traumatized by. And by holding it in, maybe they can give you a cleaner slate. I don't know, but that's what it seemed like. Thank you for that answer. All right, Peter said, Kira, one of the identities being used among environmental activists is water protector, an indigenous identity. At times, I feel honestly invited into this identity by indigenous people, and at others, I feel like there's no way I can live up to that identity. Is our collective environmental trauma giving us space to flow between different cultural identities as a way of solidarity going forward?
I would say yes. I would say that that's exactly what it's doing. The whole idea of the tent analogy in the large group, the large living things on Earth, large group is to bring people together over one crisis, which is the climate change, environmental justice. And I think that, yes, if you're being invited into that identity, I'd say go for it, because there's one goal. And if you share the same sentiments, the same ideals, ideologies, I say you're welcome in that group.
So another question is from Jenny Lee. What would you say is the best way for leaders to utilize storytelling to help heal the trauma or to support creating equitable systems? And what would we like to see, and what we would like to see in the world?
I mentioned kind of briefly just how leaders can pair like an anxiety with either hope or despair, and the different outcomes of each. And I think that when leaders can add an aspect of hope into their stories, even if it's about a traumatic event, then that would be a way to help heal the trauma, because forgiveness is a big part of that, and forgiveness and hope. we go together, especially in this sense.
So thank you for that. Robin had a question, and Tasha had a comment on it, but I'm going to go through Robin's question first. The quote was shared, empathy and power are inversely related. That was the quote, empathy and power are inversely related. Robin goes on to say, I think the particular kind of power being referred to here needs to be clarified because empathy itself is a mighty power. EcoFaith seeks to equip leaders to reclaim the powers of love, compassion, grace, forgiveness, and peacemaking through the 7 practices for awakening leadership. Rather than empathy being inversely related to power, is it possible that empathy is a more loving and life-giving form of power?
I really like that. I would 100% agree that empathy is a more loving and life-giving form of power. The power that I was talking about was like big, I don't know, like people in a place of power, I guess. Not necessarily like the power that something gives you, like empathy. Things like empathy and love and compassion and forgiveness, all of those give you power. But I wasn't really thinking of it in that way when I wrote this, but I like that a lot.
So Tasha went on to say, she said, I would say empathy is inversely related to power over, which I think is a really succinct way of saying it, that the power that you're referring to, Robin, as well, is power over. Whereas when we think of power among, and we think of building power within, those are the powers of empathy and love. And I think that that is a real valuable addition that both Robin and Tasha brought up, and is worthy of almost changing that quote, that it is, you know, that empathy is inversely related to power over. And then Tasha also went on to say that she's also heard it said that empathy is inversely related to privilege, which is a very interesting thought as well. That when you are blessed with so much privilege, you probably have to work a little bit harder to be empathetic. Whereas if you are less privileged, empathy comes a little bit easier because you're closer to what the raw emotions that are happening to you as well as others around you. So it's easier to be empathetic to that. And I would totally agree with that. I experienced that traveling in other parts of the world, and it was among the lowest income people or the most isolated indigenous peoples where empathy was universally the greatest, and where people shared the little that they had without even questioning it. So that was really cool. All right, so there's another question that came from Scott. I'm wondering whether trauma avoidance is making it more challenging to mobilize people to address climate change.
I would say that yes, it is, because when you avoid the trauma, you don't allow yourself to forgive. You don't allow yourself to become a part of that larger group and like because to become a part of the larger group, you have to be empathetic with other large groups, I guess. So the large group within the 10 of all living things, the other separate 10s, the other large group 10s within it, if you hold trauma, you don't allow yourself to forgive those other groups and work together with them to address climate change. So I would say, yeah, trauma avoidance is making it more challenging to mobilize people.
So that relates directly to another comment, one that Tasha wrote in the chat earlier. So you've got some very prescient thoughts here, Tasha. I really appreciate it. Tasha says, Peter Levine and other somatic trauma practitioners talk about how talking about trauma is often just re-traumatizing, that in order to move trauma through the body, we need to focus on the body's experience. Tasha, could you elaborate on that just a little bit before we get a reaction from Kira?
Sure. I mean, part of what strikes me, which is related to the question that Scott raised earlier, is that just talking about what our traumas are and what's hard doesn't actually heal them very well, right? That it's the body that carries trauma, both epigenetically and in other ways. And we live in a culture that devalues the body and that devalues emotion. Thank you, heteropatriarchy and capitalism. So we're like, the vulnerability that's required to attend to the trauma and the way it needs to move through our body is hugely discouraged in the culture, both on an individual level and on a group level. And so part of the practices that it seems to me need to be cultivated in order for us to be able to move through the traumas that we're experiencing around these things into a different kind of relationship with each other and with the work, is we have to attend to what's happening in our bodies, both individually and collectively. We have to be willing to be in the mess in a different way, rather than just try to think our way into a different perspective, right? Because it's not in our heads, it's in our bodies.
Yeah, to that I say trauma is 100% a response. It's a bodily response, like you said, and it's kind of like, shoot, what is it? It's like when you tell yourself to go to sleep, you can't go to sleep, but when you forget about it, you can go to sleep. Or I guess it's more like when you accept it, you can go to sleep. You kind of have to accept that it's inside of you and accept that it's inside other people, and be forgiving enough to, I guess, know that other people are just as traumatized as you are by certain events, even if they were in the opposing group, I guess. Yeah, I don't really know what else to say, but I fully agree. Trauma is in the body, trauma is in reactions.
And allowing us to feel and experience the trauma in our bodies allows us, I think, to empathize more with others who have similar or dissimilar experiences of epigenetic and intergenerational trauma. I mean, if we don't acknowledge it and we don't experience it, how can we accept it and value who others are who have been traumatized? So, yeah. Scott also wrote back before he disappeared into the ether. I think your previous statement, Kira, is spot on, that we need to conclude our stories with a message of hope so that we don't focus just on the trauma. And I think that kind of relates to what Tasha was saying as well, that we have to integrate it, we have to go through it and experience it. So now, are there other questions that people have? You don't need to write them in. We're at a point now that you could just unmute yourself and raise a question. Jenny Lee? Oh.
Suggesting.
So I'm sort of curious about the idea of empathetic trauma and what sorts of intergenerational traumas make it difficult for people to address, the climate and environmental crises. I'm just thinking particularly, I a few years ago, I went to go see the movie Sometimes a Great Notion, which involves clear cutting old growth timber in a very destructive and visceral way that my body reacted to it in a way that was like hurt. And it's like, where did that come from? Why am I hurting seeing trees get cut down? What in my past would make me feel that way? And I can sort of rationalize it about a lot of ways just because I know it's stupid. But I'm wondering how do we connect those kinds of reactions to the work of organizing and doing mutual leadership around climate and environmental activism?
I think that particular feeling of just like it's kind of like all of your senses just like overwhelmed is kind of the same thing as the time collapse that I was talking about, how it feels like everything that happened in the past, everything that's happening now is all happening at once. And I think that when leaders use the time collapse, it evokes that kind of response. And then from that response, I guess it like makes you want to do something when you feel like that. It's not something that you want to sit with. And when the leader directs it into a certain path, into a certain and this is what we can do now, I think that's how leaders can do that.
That stimulated something for me that has left me feeling helpless in the environmental movement. Change needs to happen quickly on such a large scale that it is the purview of governmental policy that needs to bring about these changes. And I can live it, I can model it, I can join with others in my local community to practice it in as many ways as I can. But is it enough to make it happen on the scale that it needs to happen? Or is that alone the motivator by making that obvious leap to enough people, enough to maybe force our leaders to do things differently? I'm not sure.
I mean, I think it's just so many people that need to do something that aren't all on the same side about other aspects, not necessarily about climate change, and people haven't, I guess, forgiven other people for conflicts or whatever they have in between them, that it's just makes it more difficult to bring people together, to bring everyone together, because that is a lot of people. Everyone is a lot of people. But yeah, I think that it should be a motivator. Like it should be the thing that motivates everybody. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case because of the lack of forgiveness and the lack of empathy that there is.
I've been spending a lot of time reading Black feminists in the last 18 months. And one of the things that I'm really struck by is the story that they're telling about it has taken us a really long time to build the situation that we're in right now, right? And it's going to take us a long time to build our way out. And that it is not actually our job to solve it or fix it, because we don't have that power, right? Our job is simply to stand where we can stand and try to create something new, right? To do the work, to participate in the change, knowing that the change that we most want is likely not going to happen in our generation, right? So they're talking about race, but I think the same thing is true of the environment. right? And yes, there is this enormous sense of urgency about, and we don't want to let go of that sense of urgency, but on the other hand, urgency in and of itself is a dominance culture norm, right? And this whole idea that we as individuals right now are somehow responsible for fixing it all is a problem, because we can't. And what happens for many of us I will speak for myself, what happens for me when I land in that place is I do nothing, because I feel powerless and hopeless and all of those things. But if I stay in this idea, like I've got a really wide sense of my spheres of concern, and then I pay attention to what are my spheres of influence, like where can I actually make change? And those are much smaller, right? And for some people they're bigger, and some, but for me, they're really small right now. And that doesn't mean I don't have the responsibility to be making change in those spheres, but it means that I will be paralyzed if I try to hold myself accountable for this other thing that I have no way to create. Right? So how do we hold those things, right? How do we recognize our smallness in addition to our bigness?
I definitely think that's a very important thing that everyone needs to hear. You can't do everything. Do your part, whatever that may be, and just encourage other people to do their part. There's not a ton you can do. You can't force people to recycle. You can't force people to do those little things that make a big difference when a lot of people do them. But once everybody takes those steps, I think once everybody realizes that they need to take those little steps, then that's when we're going to see the change, which, like I said, will take a long time. Will take a lot of convincing and work, but I think it's possible. So.
Kira, your presentation and your research has really been a gift over these months that you've gradually been sharing it, and now tonight with getting to look at the breadth of what you've been working with. This is a question really to everybody who's been participating in this tonight, and obviously including you, that when Peter talked about feeling in his body this empathy with kind of the trees or the forest and the trauma there, and it was putting me in touch with how just these conversations we've been sharing and the stories we've been sharing have put me in your presentation, your questions really put me back in touch with trauma that my grandmother experienced as a German-American immigrant who grew up speaking German in the household. And at the time of World War I, everybody were supposed to quit speaking German in any public places. And she had learned her whole catechism, memorized the whole thing in German, but now had to try in very short order to rememorize it in English. And the pastor snuck them down into the basement to try to translate for them how they could rememorize this. And she was with her grandparents one weekend when something very bad was happening to a pastor who refused to quit speaking German in this small Iowa community. And her grandparents put the fear of God into her not to dare go out on this weekend because something bad might happen to her. So your presentation has invited me just to sit with some of my own intergenerational trauma, and then to realize also how my grandmother, when she was much, much older, and I asked her about what she thought about people who had come from Mexico and other places south of the United States, and the debate that was happening about speaking English or whether you could continue to have your Spanish language in school? And she just said, well, we were forced to learn American. Or I think she probably said American, or if she didn't say English. And I think they should be too. They should have to do it too. And so you've really put me back in touch with that story of like how that trauma that was inflicted on her, though she was forced to stop, then, well, everybody else, that's what it means to be American and to assimilate and to try to be the good person. So the question really is, Peter said he was feeling in his body, and I'm feeling in my gut. I think it's my grandma's story. And I'm just wondering if anyone else is feeling it anywhere in your bodies. And if so, if you want to share where. And also, what would we like to say to those places where our own bodies, or what message or energy would we like to send to them? Because I'd love to, I don't know, just have it to follow your invitation and to kind of drop down a little bit into the body space. And what gift would we like to give or receive to those places? So I'm feeling it in my gut, and I'd like to take that energy of empathy, that power of empathy that you're inviting us into, Kira. And I've got my hands on my stomach right now. And I'm just saying, yeah, I see you. And Grandma, I feel the hurt that you, and the fear that you had to grow up with. I'm going to continue to sit with that after this, but I'm wondering if it's a question really to anybody. Are you feeling it anywhere else? And are there, what would you like to offer to those places in yourself, or to the place in me and one another, before we come to the close?
Thank you very much, Robin. That was lovely. I'm just changing rooms. I'm sorry. It puts me in mind of when I was doing some of my clinical chaplain training, and a long-standing kind of dream nightmare of mine was that of being pursued by the evil forces, the stormtroopers, whatever that represented. And in a particularly well-supported space, I was actually able to imagine what it would be like to turn and embrace, rather than running away from, those that were pursuing me. And what I came to was this image of kind of the multi-generational, the victims of multi-generational trauma within me, kind of the hungry ghost image, if you will. And it was the hungry ghost that had been pursuing me, and all they wanted was to be embraced. So to turn and acknowledge and embrace them. So thank you for that invitation, Robin.
Thank you, Marshall.
And maybe if I could just build on that a tiny bit. I know there's a whole spiritual discipline or spiritual practice around attending to sort of physical expressions and manifestations. I really appreciated, Tasha, your comments earlier. But kind of, I guess, to what I was saying, what does it look like for us to show up with compassion to our own inner demons and our own hungry ghosts? What supports us, what practices support us, and clearly this this conversation tonight is one of those opportunities to encourage us to show up with compassion to our own hungry ghosts.
really love that phrase, compassion to your own. I feel like that's a place that a lot of people struggle with a lot, is not only forgiving other people, but forgiving yourself, being empathetic towards yourself. I know that's something that I struggle with, and a lot of people that I know do, but it's compassion for yourself, I guess. It's nice.
And I think it's a big challenge for activists.
Definitely.
Also love to recommend Resma Menachem book, My Grandmother's Hands. It's a really powerful book regarding the healing of racialized trauma.
Yeah, on that note, the other book that I'm finding super useful right now is Amelia and Emily Nagoski's book, Burnout, which looks at the gender piece of that in a pretty powerful and useful way. So. They also have a podcast called the Feminist Survival Podcast. So if you prefer to get your stuff via podcast, you can do it that way. For me, a lot of this right now is showing up in my solar plexus and my heart. So I'm just holding space, yeah. But I love that hungry ghost idea. It brings up for me this question of like, what do how does that image interact with white supremacy for white people, right? How does it show up when the hungry ghosts that we're carrying include, for instance, in my family, people who own slaves, right? And what is that like that we're processing there, in addition to, the miners and the auto workers and the Dust Bowl farmers, and like, so there's all of that in that family too. But there is also minor gentry that came over and were part of that ruling class. And so there's a whole aspect of trauma that comes with being the perpetrator, right? With being the creator of violence, which requires a different kind of attention and healing. It's still trauma and it still requires that, but it's enough different that I think we need to, I need to keep working for myself.
That's definitely a transgenerational trauma, collective trauma, chosen trauma. And I feel like that requires a lot more of the being compassionate and empathetic towards yourself, as well as other people. But I definitely feel like it's more to yourself and to your ancestors, your family. It's just, I don't know, it is very different. And there are different feelings that accompany that.
Since we're mentioning resources, I'll just give a shout out to Dr. Kristen Neff and Mindful Self-Compassion. It's really right at the heart of what we're talking about just now.
Marshall, I'm having trouble hearing you. Can you repeat that with a little more mic?
Sure. Mindful Self-Compassion with Dr. Kristen Neff, N-E-F-F. So if you just go to the website, Mindful Self-Compassion, there's wonderful resources there. But particularly for folks in, well, activists or helping roles. I'll write it in the chat. Yeah, thank you, Jenny. Yeah.
Awesome. Right, are there any more questions or comments before we head to the spiritual regrounding?
Just a big thank you. You've clearly done so much research here and just very vulnerably sharing about your own story and your family's story, and just feel very honored. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for showing up. All right, so for our regrounding, I would like to invite Robin to read this short poem by Tupac Shakur called "The Rose That Grew from Concrete."
Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's law is wrong, it learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared.
Awesome. Thank you, Robin. Thank you all so much for coming to my presentation. I know you're all very busy, so I appreciate you making time for this. I'm so happy that you all have finally seen everything that I've been doing. And I wanted to thank Jenny Lee, Scott, Michael, and Robin for helping me out today. And a huge thank you to everyone for all the support you've given me since I've been here. I've really had an amazing time. And I'll leave the Zoom open for a little bit longer if anyone has any last questions. But I know we've gone super over, so.
Thank you so much, Kira. It's just
Thanks,
been
Kira.
a complete delight to get to work with you. Kira started this intern when she came into it, did not know what her project was going to be. And so just had to even just discern that, and then came up with such a focus that became such a powerful source of conversation and agitation and reflection for our leaders as people heard about what she was working on. It wasn't only something that was edifying for her, but something that really gave EcoFaith leaders a lot to reflect on. So it's been a real gift, Kira, and I really appreciate the way you've picked up on EcoFaith practice number 3 about discovering our stories and really modeled how to go after your own story and to do it in a way that at the intersection of storytelling and the Marshall Gantz model that we practice so frequently, is weekly, actually, most of us, how we can share our stories to help make a difference in the transformation of the world for that kind of power among that we believe the divine is calling us to, away from those models of power over. So thank you for the gift that you are to EcoFaith, Kira. Thank you so much.
Kira.
Thank you, Kira.
Thank you.
To
Mm.